Pokrovsk direction remains the main focus in the context of the Russian occupiers' offensive. That is where the highest number of daily enemy assault actions are recorded. This was reported by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrskyi. For their offensive, the Russian invaders in particular are trying to take advantage of the difficult weather conditions. However, according to the Commander-in-Chief, over the past week, the defense forces managed to clear 7.5 square kilometers of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the suburbs of Pokrovsk.
Our main tasks remain the gradual taking control of certain areas, supporting and protecting existing logistics routes, as well as organizing additional ones to ensure our defenders are provided with everything they need in a timely manner, and to guarantee the uninterrupted evacuation of the wounded. On the approaches and directly within the urban area, the fight against small enemy assault infantry groups is ongoing, and less frequently, the destruction of light enemy equipment. The servicemen of the Ukrainian Defense Forces are doing everything possible to prevent the enemy from moving and gaining a foothold. There's no question of Russian control over the city of Pokrovsk or of the Ukrainian Defense Forces grouping being operationally encircled. Oleksandr Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Telegram.
At the same time, partisans from the Atesh movement report that the Russians are urgently transferring reinforcements to Pokrovsk. Agents are recording columns of military vehicles with personnel every day. The soldiers are most likely being pulled from the Kherson and Zaporizhia directions. Atesh agents report that the Russian army has exhausted its main forces and operational reserves, so they're being forced to weaken other sections of the front.
There are figures coming from the Russian side, from Russian war correspondents, where they claim that during the assault on the city of Pokrovsk, the Russian Federation lost as many, or maybe even a bit more, lost as many people as during the assault on the city of Bakhmut. At that time, let me remind you, they lost about 20,000 people. That was the number being discussed. 13 months, even 14 months of assault operations shows that we're not talking about, just 2,000 or 3,000 people. We're talking about over 10,000 Russian servicemen killed as a result of the assault on just this one settlement.
Meanwhile, on the Lyman front, the Russian army attacked in the areas of the settlements of Redkadub, Grekivka, Karpovka, Novosolovka, as well as towards Dribishevo and Korovy Yar. In the Slovyansk direction, the enemy launched assaults near Dronovka, Serebyanka, and Vyemka. And near Konstantinovka, the Russians tried to advance at Pleshievka, Sherbinovka, Yablanovka, Sofievka, and Konstantinovka itself.
We are conducting counterterrorism operations if the groups are small, or launching flanking counterattacks. This is very important right now, not only to prevent the enemy from having any prospects of advancing or encircling the city, but also to discourage any attempts by larger units to move forward. It's a very systematic approach. It gives us the ability not only to strike at the flanks, but also to hit the rear and reserves.
The attempt by the Russian army to break through to Konstantinovka was thwarted by the soldiers of the 28th Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after the Knights of the Winter Campaign. They reported that the enemy tried to take advantage of the thick fog to move unnoticed toward the city. However, Ukrainian scouts detected the saboteurs in time and then opened targeted fire. Operators of the 8th Special Operations Forces Regiment cleared enemy positions in the Donetsk region. As a result of their swift and precise actions, 3 Russian occupiers were eliminated. In addition, Ukrainian fighters managed to capture the enemy's radios and personal documents. And in temporarily occupied Feodosia, Ukrainian fighters from the 14th Separate Unmanned Systems Regiment struck the sea terminal. 2 fuel storage tanks were damaged. The hub is a key logistical node for supplying fuel by sea to temporarily occupied Crimea. In addition, Ukraine's defense forces struck the Stavro land plant. The enterprise in Stavropol Krai produces polymers used to manufacture composite materials, body parts, seals, and insulation for various equipment of the Russian army.
So another 1,180 Russian occupiers were eliminated by Ukraine's defense forces on the front lines over the past day. Thus, according to the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, the total combat losses of the Russian army since the start of the full-scale invasion have already exceeded 1,155,000 soldiers. In addition, Ukrainian fighters destroyed 11 armored vehicles, 2 air defense systems, and shot down 141 operational tactical level UAVs, also destroyed 88 units of enemy automotive equipment.
And overall, there were 216 combat engagements on the front lines over the past day. This was reported by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. On the Orikhiv direction, the Russian army attacked the defense forces' positions 5 times. In the Hvardiyske sector, 6 times. In the Kupiansk and Slovyansk sectors, 7 times each. There were 13 clashes in the Oleksandrivka direction, 17 in the southern Slobozhansky sector, and 24 in the Konstantinivka sector. In the Lyman direction, Russian occupiers attempted to advance 31 times, but the hottest spot on the front remains the Pokrovsk direction. There were 78 attacks there in just one day.
For more details about what's happening at the front, we'll talk with our guest, Ihor Romanenko, founder of the charitable foundation Close the Sky of Ukraine. The Lieutenant General is joining us to our broadcast. Ihor Oleksandrovich, good morning and glory to Ukraine.
Welcome.
Ihor Alexandrovich, I welcome you and our viewers.
Ihor Oleksandrovich, just now we presented the General Staff's report to our viewers, and in particular, it mentioned the Konstantinivka direction. A certain thought crossed my mind. Why are we talking so much right now about what's happening in the Pokrovsk direction, including why it's so important to hold Pokrovsk, why Ukrainian defenders are fighting for it? Yes, because essentially, if something goes wrong, and depending on how events unfold, will the Konstantinivka direction even remain? Or, considering that Pokrovsk is situated at quite a high elevation, it would mean having to retreat very far to rather distant positions. So yes, that's the importance, why there are such fierce battles and so much attention on Pokrovsk and the Pokrovsk direction right now.
Because in military affairs, the focus is always on the main, most important objective. Since, as a rule, there are almost never enough resources, both sides act this way. And now, besides the Pokrovsk direction, another hot spot has emerged related to Zaporizhia, where the enemy managed to advance and capture several settlements. And the situation, let's say, has worsened and become more complicated toward Hvardiyske. This is a very important logistical and defensive point and area for us. That's why, with limited resources, the commander-in-chief makes decisions about possible redeployment. The situation in Pokrovsk itself and in Myrnograd is very difficult. And so for Konstantinivka, of course, this is the next direction, which is very important in the fight, as in the enemy's plans. The line includes Konstantinivka, Drushkivka, Slovyansk, and Kramatorsk. This is from the southern direction toward this line, while from the north, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, these are combat operations happening around Lyman, and you gave a report on the intensity of fighting around Lyman and Borova. The intensity is increased, and that's why the enemy sees that an advance on this line is being planned both from the northeast and from the south through Konstantinivka. That's why its role and significance are considerable. Recently, the enemy has advanced here in the southwest. Unfortunately, but overall the positions are being held and fighting continues. There are 3 directions toward Konstantinivka: from the west, from the south near Toretsk, and from the direction of Chasiv Yar in the area of Stupichki. Well, that's how things look at the moment.
Igor Alexandrovich, we also understand that the Russians are trying to act not just on different physical sections of the front, but in various spheres as well. But in particular, I'd like to talk with you about the fact that the Russians are spreading fake footage supposedly showing the withdrawal of Ukraine's defense forces from Pokrovsk in the Donetsk region. This was reported by Andriy Kovalenko, the head of the Center for Countering Disinformation. According to him, verification of the video using special software shows that it was created with the help of artificial intelligence. This is indicated by unnatural speech and a stretcher that seems to float in the air. And let's be honest, there are even extra legs on the soldiers and a wheelchair that moves by itself. Kovalenko also notes that, for credibility, Russian propaganda generated videos that supposedly show the situation from different angles. Their goal is to demoralize Ukrainian society and discredit the armed forces of Ukraine. Igor Alexandrovich, your comment on how the Russians are acting right now. Here I would also like to remind and point out how Putin and all that gang around him claimed that Pokrovsk had supposedly already been captured, and they were even talking about organizing tours there for the media so that so-called media representatives could report on what is really happening in that settlement. What is your comment on this information approach that propagandists in the Russian army are trying to use?
Tuning is conducting an information operation, and this fits into their approach, which is also followed by our side, the Defense Forces of Ukraine, that the informational component of hybrid and large-scale war is very important. The whole question is how this is carried out, that is, in most cases. We show objective factors and conduct information work around them. But the enemy often, in a very Goebbels-like way, I would say, uses the achievements of modern artificial intelligence. And that episode, which is now spread widely across the internet about that breakthrough, is pure fake. How he moves around on those crutches, or the wheelchair. Anyone who's ever dealt with that kind of thing can tell. I had an episode in my life where I had to use one myself. I was in the hospital, riding between floors in that wheelchair to visit my subordinates who ended up there. From my personal experience, it doesn't look at all like what was shown there. Anyone who knows understands this, but God willing, may fewer people ever have to know or go through that. That's why it's important to explain that this is fake, that it's a forgery, that it's a propaganda trick the enemy's using, without a doubt, for their own purposes. And as for any kind of internal ethics, well, their ethical standards are just completely incompatible with this. And that's why, once again, we come back to the idea that information hygiene is essential. You have to train yourself in this regard, if you will. You need to approach this very critically, especially since we're in the middle of a war with all the consequences that come with it. We can't and don't want to contribute to the spread and influence of this kind of thing. Information on ourselves, our families, our circles, our acquaintances. And that's why we need to resist this, to explain things. In other words, to take part in this very important and necessary work. Thank you, and the other channels that are working on this.
Igor Alexandrovich, I also wanted to point out, lately I've been coming across pages on various social networks that were literally created just a couple of days ago. They don't last very long. And, supposedly these are from, let's say, communities or groups that are located near or practically on the line of contact. And do you know what they keep right about? That everything is lost. The Ukrainian armed forces are surrounded in Zaporizhia and so on and so on. Pretending, to be people who are actually on the ground. Well, it's obvious that bots are at work, propagandists are at work, this whole information machine is operating, and it's really aimed at dividing us and, putting us into a certain destabilized state. And understanding that the situation is difficult, we still need to filter what we read, what we see, and trust only verified and official information.
By the way, I think that... Yes, of course. Please continue, Igor Alexandrovich. I
would like to draw our viewers' attention to certain circumstances regarding this kind of presentation and this episode. This is being done based on information from around or near the line of contact. So people, and generally speaking, it's about caring for the Russian world, for our citizens, ordinary people. Of the people who, as they say, are being controlled there by these bloodthirsty leaders, military, civilian, and all the rest. But if we look at the experience, and unfortunately we do have experience with occupied territories, lands we have taken back, although now everything is much more difficult at the front, people there know the real situation from their own experience. This kind of care. That's why, once again, we can return to this and encourage our citizens to remember, to take an interest in all these events, and to clearly show where there is enough information, where you can see for yourself how this so-called Russian world takes care of our citizens. So this started at the beginning of the war, and it continues. Lists were made of our citizens who simply had to be destroyed. These included law enforcement, families, and so on. Then there were the unreliable ones, who were to be sent to constitutional camps, the second list, and finally a third group with whom it was possible to work. So it's important to remind people of these kinds of circumstances, and then how it all turned out. We know this from Kyiv region, and we know it from other places as well, which in general were occupied, Kherson region, Kharkiv region, and were liberated from these territories and saw the horrors that were committed there. That's why. Such information requires an appropriate perception, attitude, and mandatory explanation. We should have no illusions about the kindness of Russian troops, the fascists. We must not have any.
Absolutely, Igor Alexandrovich, that's true. But, you know, I would also advise everyone who comes across such pages, or if they pop up. You see, we were just talking here with Akaterina, and she pointed out that certain posts are indeed being taken down, and this propaganda is still somehow present. And as we can see, no one from the social media management is really paying much attention to it yet. But here, each of us can draw our own conclusions and interact with certain pages and those same public groups, just guys, yeah, by simply sending what?
2 clicks, a complaint.
And that's it. 2 clicks, a complaint, false content that's trying to destabilize the situation. And I often mark it as terrorist content that's trying to spread disinformation in the social networks we use. Thank you for the conversation. We appreciate you joining us. Ihor Normanenko, founder of the Close the Sky of Ukraine Charitable Foundation, Lieutenant General, was with us live.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukrainian all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.